When the midnight movie ended, Daniel Reed stayed in his seat. The credits had finished several minutes earlier. Normally, the house lights would come up, the cleaners would enter, and the last few people would drift toward the exits. But that night, the theater remained dark. Only the green emergency sign above the door was still glowing. Daniel assumed there had been a technical problem. He stood, took 2 steps toward the aisle, and the screen came back to life. There was no studio logo, no commercial, no trailer. The screen showed the theater he was standing in, not a recording from months ago, not security footage from a different angle. It was the same theater less than 15 minutes earlier. Daniel watched the audience still seated in their places. Someone was reaching for a drink on the floor. Someone else was pulling on a coat. In the middle rows, he saw himself. Then the movie ended inside the movie. People began to leave, but the Daniel on the screen did not head for the exit. He rose from his seat and walked toward the front of the auditorium. Daniel looked down at the real space beneath the screen. There was the first row, row A, and in front of it there should have been nothing. But on the screen there was another row, 9 deep red seats pressed close to the screen. They had no letter, no numbers. They looked older than the rest of the theater, as if they had been installed for a room that no longer existed. The Daniel on the screen walked to the 5th seat and sat down. Then the screen went black. Daniel did not move for several seconds. He worked as a documentary editor. He knew memory could bend under stress. He knew witnesses could disagree about an event they had all seen. But he trusted raw footage more than he trusted almost anything. He took out his phone and aimed the camera at the empty space in front of row A. On the phone screen, the seats appeared again. For a moment, Daniel wondered whether the camera had caught a reflection from the screen. He moved to the left, then to the right. The row changed perspective with him. The nearest armrest grew larger. The farthest seat disappeared behind the edge of the screen, exactly as it should have. It was not an image floating over the theater. It was occupying space. 9 of them, clear enough to see the worn fabric and the dark metal armrests. Daniel lowered the phone. The row vanished. He raised it again. It returned. He tried the exit door. The handle turned, but there was nothing behind it. No catch. No resistance. It felt as though the door had been painted onto a wall. A few minutes later, a side door opened behind him. Claire Morgan, the night manager, stepped into the theater with a ring of keys in her hand. She was 32, tired looking, and still wearing the dark uniform of the cinema. She saw Daniel's phone screen. Her face changed. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked at the row that only the camera could see. "Don't go looking for those seats." It was the first thing she said that mattered. Daniel asked whether she had seen them before. Claire did not answer. She told him to come with her. The projection room above the auditorium was quiet, filled with server racks, status screens, and the soft, constant sound of cooling fans. Claire brought up the file from the movie that had just ended. Its official running time was 2 hours, 7 minutes, and 14 seconds. The playback log showed 2 hours, 13 minutes, and 14 seconds. Exactly 6 minutes longer. It was not an ad break. It was not a delay. The system insisted the extra 6 minutes belonged to the film itself. Daniel examined the data. A corrupted file would have broken frames, repeated packets, obvious gaps. This was different. Every second contained a full amount of image data, as if something had been recorded that ordinary software could not display. He exported the missing 6 minutes. The file opened on a second monitor. At first, it showed an empty auditorium. Then, a woman appeared in a seat. She did not walk in. She was simply there, as if an editor had dropped her into the shot without a transition. Then a second audience member appeared. Then a third within seconds. Everyone from that night's screening had returned to the image, but none of them were seated where they had actually been. Every person had been moved closer to the screen. Someone from row G was now in row D. Someone who had chosen an aisle seat sat in the center. The closer a person had originally been to the screen, the smaller the change. Then Daniel appeared. He had bought seat F12. He remembered it clearly in the footage. He was sitting in B17. The image continued. Every audience member turned toward the screen at the same time. Only Daniel stood. He left B17 and walked toward the unlisted row. Daniel paused the video. The 9 seats were clearer than before. On the 5th chair, there was a small pale mark on the backrest. It looked like a character that had been erased. Claire finally told him the truth. 3 years earlier, on another midnight shift, she had seen the same thing. The screen had shown an empty theater, then another Claire walking toward the row. The real Claire had been too frightened to investigate. She shut down the projection system and left the building. She had believed that refusing the invitation was enough. But the next morning, small pieces of a life she did not remember began appearing around her. There was a ticket stub for 2 people at a music festival. A lease agreement with her name and the name of a man she had never met. A number in her phone contacts with no name attached. Everything suggested that the man had once belonged in her life. Only Claire remembered nothing about him. She eventually found him online. He was real. He had moved to another state. His photographs, his friends, his old posts, none of them showed Claire. What unsettled her most was that the stranger's name had not felt entirely unfamiliar. Whenever she saw it, she would remember a feeling rather than an event. Rain on an apartment window, 2 coffee cups on a counter, someone laughing in another room. The details vanished as soon as she tried to hold them. That was why she had kept working night shifts. She wanted to know whether she had imagined everything. At the same time, she was terrified the cinema would give her proof that she had not. "I thought the seats took people," she said. "Now I think they take something else." Daniel searched the cinema's old maintenance files. Over the previous 10 years, there had been 7 incidents with the same extra 6 minutes. The films were unrelated. The dates were random, but after every incident, the ticketing system had briefly listed 9 more seats than the auditorium physically contained. No one had been reported missing. What changed were the records around them. One customer later claimed to remember a job he had never held. Another received family photos from a vacation no one else remembered taking. A woman spent months arguing with her sister about a wedding that, according to every document, had never happened. Daniel looked at Claire's old incident again. She had never taken a seat, yet her life had still changed. Avoiding the row had not stopped the process. It had only left something unfinished. They returned to the auditorium. On Daniel's phone screen, the row was brighter now. 2 of the 9 seats had folded down, as if someone had recently sat in them. Then the 5th seat lowered by itself. In the real theater, Daniel heard a soft sound of fabric settling beneath weight. Claire told him not to go closer. Daniel fixed his phone to his chest and started a continuous recording. If doing nothing allowed the damage to continue, he said, then fear was not a solution. He followed the row on his screen until he stood directly in front of the 5th seat. To his eyes, he was standing on bare carpet. Then he sat down. He expected to fall. Instead, something caught him, a cold metal armrest pressed against his hand. A soft seat cushion held his weight. The screen lit up. It did not show the theater. It showed a bright editing studio. Daniel was there. Not the Daniel sitting in the invisible chair, but another version of him. His hair was shorter. He wore a suit. He was speaking with a group of people around a monitor. On the wall behind him hung a movie poster. The director's name was Daniel Reed. The images moved forward. A premiere interviews, an award stage, a house Daniel had never lived in, a woman he did not know but who clearly knew him, children's drawings held to a refrigerator by magnets. None of it felt like a wish being granted. Daniel looked for mistakes, dates, weather, street signs, news headlines in the background, the order of events. Everything was right. At 27, he had been offered a chance to direct a low-budget feature. In his own life, he had refused because the producers wanted to change the ending. He had walked away, then moved into documentary editing. The other Daniel had accepted the compromise. His first film had succeeded. His life had split in a completely different direction. Daniel had spent years believing that he had made one choice once and lived with it. But what the screen showed was not a fantasy about what might have been. It was a life that had happened. There was one detail that made it harder to look away. In the other Daniel's studio, a framed photograph sat beside the monitor. It showed an older version of Daniel with his parents at a small premiere. His father had died in Daniel's own life, before he ever saw his son complete a film. The photograph did not make the other life look perfect. It made it look painfully specific. It contained a grief Daniel recognized and a joy he had never been allowed to have. Then the other Daniel entered a cinema, the same cinema. He sat alone in an empty auditorium and watched a screen showing Daniel's actual life, the cheap editing suites, abandoned projects, long nights, and all the relationships that had failed to become anything more. The two Daniels saw each other. The version on the screen stopped watching his movie and looked straight through it, straight at Daniel for the first time. Daniel wanted to leave, but the invisible chair seemed deeper now. It was not holding him down. It simply made the act of standing feel heavy, like waking from a dream before the dream had finished. The screen began showing their lives side by side. The same parents, the same childhood home, the same university, the same friends, until the decision at 27. Then the screen showed other people who had sat in the row over the years. Each of them saw another life. Sometimes it was richer. Sometimes it was lonelier. Sometimes it was almost identical. But after the two versions saw each other, ordinary life began producing impossible leftovers. A voicemail in a familiar voice describing a conversation that had never happened. A photo of a room that had never existed. A friend who remembered a different first meeting. Daniel thought of Claire's tickets, the lease, the stranger in her contacts. Those things were not proof that someone had been erased. They were evidence that another life had touched this one. The screen went still. Words appeared without sound. Stop watching. The border will close, Daniel understood at last. The row was not asking him to decide which Daniel deserved to live. Both of them were real. It was offering them one choice only: close the passage between their lives before the two stories became impossible to separate. On the screen, the other Daniel understood too. He walked to a projection control panel in his own theater. Daniel watched him hesitate. Then he pressed the shutdown button. Daniel had expected a fight. He had expected the other version of himself to protect the better life. Instead, the other Daniel simply chose not to let a machine decide whose life was more valid. At that moment, Claire's phone lit up. On its screen, in the far corner of the theater, stood another Claire. She was not wearing a cinema uniform. A man stood beside her, the same stranger from the lease agreement. Claire did not move toward them. She did not cry. She only watched through the small screen for a long time. 3 years earlier, she had been terrified that something had been stolen from her. Now she understood that the missing life had not been stolen. It had belonged to someone real. Daniel reached for the control panel in front of him and shut down his own screen. The auditorium went black. Several seconds later, the house lights came on. The invisible seat was gone. Daniel fell heavily onto the carpet. The exit door worked again. In the projection room, the 6-minute file had disappeared from the server. Claire stood a few feet away, holding her phone against her chest. She asked Daniel what he had seen. He did not explain everything. He only told her that the row did not choose anyone's life. It only forced people to understand that they were not the only version of themselves that could be real. For 3 weeks, nothing strange happened. Daniel's phone recording still existed, but the seats had vanished from it. The video showed him walking to the front of the theater and stopping in empty air for several minutes. Claire's old artifacts did not disappear. Her incident had been left unfinished years ago. But no new traces appeared. Then Daniel passed the cinema one afternoon. A new poster stood in the lobby. It advertised a documentary called The Row That Wasn't There. The director was Daniel Reed. Daniel had never made it. The running time was 2 hours, 13 minutes, and 14 seconds. He bought a ticket. Most of the documentary was about his life. It showed him editing films, working late, and returning to the cinema that night. Daniel sat in the audience without speaking. Then the movie entered the empty auditorium. On the screen, Daniel walked toward the invisible row and sat in the 5th chair. This time, the seats had not been erased. They were perfectly visible. The camera angle shifted. It turned away from the screen and faced the audience. Daniel saw himself sitting in the theater. The same clothes, the same seat. The same body leaning slightly forward. On screen, Daniel lifted his head. In the real theater, Daniel slowly lifted his head too. The unlisted row appeared at the front of the movie theater. 9 seats. In the 5th seat sat Daniel from 3 weeks earlier. In another seat was a blurred figure. The 3rd seat was empty. The movie stopped. There were no credits. The lights did not come up. Daniel finally understood that the cinema had never wanted anyone to disappear. It had never needed a winner. It needed an observer. Someone who had seen 2 versions of a life and admitted that both had been real. The moment Daniel sat in the 5th seat, he had become part of the cinema's record. His life had not been replaced, but from then on, he was both a viewer and a story that could be watched somewhere else. At last, the lights came on. The audience stood and left. Daniel remained seated for a moment. He looked at the normal row A, then at the empty space in front of it. He could not see anything there, but he no longer believed that what he could not see was not there. He rose and walked into the lobby. Behind him, the screen stayed black. Then the electronic ticket display above the concession stand flickered. Daniel turned back. The screen showed a message no employee would ever type. Auditorium seat count unchanged. New projection log entry, recorded observer, Daniel Reed, status, seat assigned.